So today I will tell you a bit what the study of gold threads can provide us, and especially the study of gold threads in these three areas. By the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, promoted by the Mongolian conquest of Eastern Asian territories, the open trade routes between the Mediterranean and China and the extensive movement of goods gave rise to an unprecedented trade and exchange of silk and gold fabrics and their raw materials from east to west. The Mongol domination gave rise to a process of cultural unification in the conquered lands through the creation and diffusion of a new shared language of luxury in which precious fabrics played a fundamental role. The migration of technologies and ornamental futures between East and West resulted briefly in a shared international silk design characterized by a repertory of motifs recurrent in the textile production of the region extending from Italy to Central Asia. Some motifs were not just copied, but integrated into traditional and indigenous patterns, inspiring and developing new and original ones. There was an appropriation and reinterpretation of the motifs, and the technology transfer of weaving techniques and perhaps gold threads was also a result of the forced relocation of artisans from one area to another, bringing with them their technology. For this reason, 13th and 14th century productions sometimes are still today challenging to distinguish, while sometimes specific features made possible to relate them to their place of origin. The arrival of the expensive and assumed to as exotic silks promoted a great interest into the 13th and 14th century European society. Contemporary painters were fascinated and inspired by the beauty and splendor of these fabrics that made up ecclesiastical or noble and courtly vestments. Painters experimented and developed different techniques to reproduce gold textiles colors, patterns, and textures with great care, sometimes resembling so perfectly as the original to seem like miniatures. However, the depiction of textile was not always aimed to a realistic reproduction. In some cases, the use of gilded fabrics served as a specific aim and were charged with a symbolic and allegoric meaning. Moreover, some patterns and models were reproduced as stock designs and were recurrent in decades, thus not necessarily contemporary to the textile production of the time. In this case, I will show you the Wilton diptych, that is one of the most interesting paintings of the late 14th century, assessing the evolution of the international silk design of the time. So in the robe of these two characters, Edmund and Richard II, we can see how two different styles coexisted in this moment. In the robe of Richard, we have a more naturalistic representation, so these animal motifs that are framed with roundels. And in the second one, St. Edmund, we have a more dynamic composition with birds that are painted in gold with on a blue ground. As you can see here, these two similar pattern textiles. Another extraordinary example of realistic depiction of textile oriental patterns is attested by Simone Martini reproduction of one of the most famous examples of Mongolian silk survived in European church treasuries, and part of the ecclesiastical vestments associated with Pope Benedict XI. The complete set of vestments is preserved in the Church of San Domenico in Perugia and has been the object of several studies, the most comprehensive one recently published. The vestments are made up of many silk fabrics with different patterns and different origins. The principal silk of the dalmatic and the cope that you can see here, these fragments, mostly conserved in Perugia, but the other two fragments are dispersed in the Cleveland and Metropolitan Museum of Art, have a white ground and gold pattern of small thin leaves and flowers, and it has been assigned to the Central Asian Mongolian manufacture. The gold threads on this silk are flat strips of leather gilded on one side, which in agreement with N. Wardwell are of Central Asian production too. In the Annunciation of Simone Martini, he developed a new method known as sgraffito technique to depict pattern oriental textiles and reproduce realistically their textures. as for the robe of the Archangel Gabriel, and the choice to granulate the gold surface was to imitate the uneven texture of the brocade on Oriental silks. So in 13th and 14th century Eurasian textiles, the gold element was predominant. Different types have been used during these centuries, but benefited of greater popularity the organic-based metal thread type. And these metal threads were very flexible, lightweight in weaving, and they allowed a reduced price. They apparently were similar to the gold threads made with sheets of almost pure gold, but of course they were less expensive. I will tell you today of this, one of this type of organic-based metal threads, which is animal-based. Basically, the strip was made by a protein-based substrate, in this case membrane or skin-based, or it can be also with paper-based substrate. They have been used differently according to geographical areas. Solid metal threads and animal-based metal threads and skin-based metal threads were used largely in many geographical areas from Europe to the Far East. Conversely, membrane metal threads and paper-based metal threads were mostly used in specific areas. Membrane-based metal threads mostly in Europe, Italy and Germany, but also some evidence of the use of these threads in Middle East can be found, while paper-based metal threads were mostly used in Far East. So it was an exclusive production of China and Japan. These threads have been used in two ways. All of them have been used as composite threads, so the strips were wound then around a fibrous core, or they can be used as well as just flat strips, so without a core. The only type that was used only as a composite thread, so we didn't find any evidence of the use of it as a flat strip, is the membrane-based thread type. So tracing their historical development is still challenging. We have evidence of the first appearance of a gilt organic thread in the 6th century in the Famine Temple in China, but unfortunately the substrate was completely degraded, so it was not possible to identify exactly the type of thread. What we can say based on analytical data is that the first appearance in Europe date back to the 10th-11th century in Al-Andalus, and they were gilt skin thread. During the 13th and 14th century, then we have an extensive production of these threads all over these Eurasian territories. But during these centuries, we have as well a European production that was considered by many historians as a less expensive imitation, because they were not pure gold threads on skin substrate. They were made by coating with gilt silver membrane substrate. And during at the end of the 15th century, we have no evidence of their use in Europe. However, they were still used in the Far East, in China and Japan during the 20th century. So here I'm going to present you the study that I have conducted with a team, mostly on these three areas. So those that we have assigned to Asian, Mongol ruled territories, Italian or Persian, and the case that for us are certainly from Italy. We have been studying flat strips, so skin-based metal threads as flat strip and rapid strips, and as well membrane-based metal threads. We applied a multi-analytical approach, so starting from a closing examination of the threads directly on the textile, and then on samples, we have conducted microanalysis to characterize the metal coating as well as the substrate of the strips. And here are a few examples of the most representative cases. This is a dalmatic that has been considered one of the most interesting Tartar clothes coming from Central Asia to Europe. It is actually in Germany, in the Stralsund museum, and it has been done with 5 different fabrics. I will show you the results that we have achieved on gold thread in 2 of these fabrics. On this fabric, we have found these strips that are flat strips, and they have been coated just on one side. You can see the front and the back side of the strip. Microanalysis revealed that the metal coating was made by almost pure gold, and the stratigraphy of the sample, so basically we took the sample, embedded in resin, and under a UV light, we observed the cross-section of the thread. So you can see the different layers that made up the thread, very complex structure. You can see in the layer 1 the metal coating, and then we have found in all these category of threads adhesive layer used both in the back of the strip as well as to join the metal to the skin. In this particular case, 2 strips of skins have been coupled together with a middle layer of adhesive, probably to get a thicker strip. And indeed, the thickness of the strip, this is one of the most thick that we have found, of 200 microns. The proteomics analysis help us to identify for the first time the origin and animal species of the skin as well as of the adhesive. And we have found that they use sheep leather, and the adhesive was a mixture of sturgeon glue and cattle hide glue. In these other fabrics, present always in the dalmatic, the thread is a bit different. So it's always a flat strip of skin-based thread, but the coating was in both sides, so in the front and in the back of the strip. And here the microanalysis has revealed that in the front side we have almost pure gold, while on the back side we found gilt silver. The stratigraphy again is a kind of complex, so we have 2 different adhesive layers, in this case to join the 2 metal coatings to the strip. The strip is made by tanned leather that has been identified by proteomics again as sheep leather. But in this case, a different mixture of adhesive has been used. So we have sturgeon glue and horsehide glue. This is an interesting fragment that is collected in the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. They assigned this textile to Spanish or Iranian manufacture, but as you can see, the gold thread has features very similar to the previous one. So for us, it is more Asian Mongol production. And indeed, Echasubo, that is the complete vestment of this fragment, has been assigned as an Asian manufacturer. In this case, the coating was just on one side, and this is just the only difference that we have found with the previous strips. So the coating was not almost pure gold, but was an alloy of gold, silver, and copper. So it may be because it was produced in a different workshop, or maybe it was intentionally done in this way for the visual effect that it has to be at the end. Again, we have same stratigraphy or similar, and the materials of the strip are quite similar. So we have always a sheep leather strip, but the adhesive in this case was just sturgeon glue. Here is an example of Italian or Middle Eastern production. Many textiles of this period, 13th, 14th century, that has this similar design, so in gold with on a blue ground. They are kind of controversial because many museums assign them to the Persian production and many others to the Italian one. We have tried to study gold threads to understand if we can in some way provide a further criteria to distinguish them. But what we have found is that they all show the same characteristic that I'm showing you now. So we have threads that are always made by leather in S-wrapped direction. So they were wrapped around a core made by linen fibers. The core was done with 3 yarns plied together in S direction. Sometimes we have found as well a core made by 2 single yarns, and just in an exception that we have studied, we found silk. So these little differences may be related to different workshops or different production areas. But we are still far to be able to define if they correspond exactly to Persian or Italian production. Microanalysis, in this case, for all the samples like this, show that the coating was almost pure gold, and the stratigraphy of the strip is very basic. So we have a metal coating, the number 1 you can see, then the adhesive layer, and then the strip. In this case, the strips were very thinner compared to the Asian flat strips. But again, proteomics tell us that they were made with sheep leather. And again, the adhesive we used was sturgeon glue. Here I'm going to present you an example of membrane thread. And this was considered an Italian production, for sure. We have similar wrapping or same wrapping direction than the thread that I showed you before. In S direction, the core is always made by linen, and the construction of the core is pretty similar. So we have 2 yarns plied together in S twist direction. Microanalysis here tell us that we have a membrane and not a leather. You can see a very whitish membrane. So it is because it was not tanned. And the proteomics analysis identified as coming from a cattle animal species. The presence of proteins belonging to the smooth muscle that are typical of gastrointestinal tract organs allowed us to think that maybe these membranes were coming from this type of tissues. And we didn't find evidence of any adhesive in this case, neither in looking at the sample in cross-section or by proteomics analysis. However, it can be also present an adhesive, but if it was of the same animal species than the membrane, we are not able to distinguish it. So we need to further investigate and understand if they use any kind of adhesive to join the metal to the strip. And in this case, the coating is less precious, so we have gilt silver coatings. This is the last example. The Museum of Terrassa assigned this fragment to Persian production, but according to the study of the membrane thread, we didn't find any clear difference that help us to distinguish this production to the previous one. So for us, it's challenging to say that one production was Italian and one production was Persian. And indeed, you can see that we got same results as well by microanalysis. The only difference that we have found was the thickness of the membrane, but in all the samples that we have analyzed, this feature has been assigned more to the type of tissue that they probably have used to make the membrane and not to the production area of the threads. So concluding, regardless the provenance that museums or churches has assigned to these textiles, we attempted a classification of the gold threads according to their materials and technical features. And you can see how these 3 groups shared some common features. So this may be a clue of the cross-current transfer of technology that we have seen as well in the decorative motifs. So probably as well the choice of materials or the techniques that they have used have something in common because there was a transfer of technology. But you can see also some differences, and these differences for us can be the specificity and peculiarity of each production. We have found more diversity in the Asian group. Of course, we are talking of a very wide territory, so maybe these little differences can be assigned to different workshops. And of course, we need to further investigate and develop this research. And for now, these results are very promising, and thank you for your attention.